And we are live. So, guys, welcome to another Playing to Win episode. The last one was actually Dr. Orion Taraban's recording from my 1% forum in Toronto back in January that I released. We have him live today, and we're going to talk about his book, The Value of Others, which was recently just published and released on Amazon. You should have your copy. If you don't, you're going to want to get it after this podcast. You must have been busy putting this book together and doing a bit of a podcast tour right now. How are things with you?
Well, first of all, Rich, it's great to see you again. Thanks for having me back on the show. The book has absolutely kept me preoccupied. It was kind of my third job after my private practice and all of the content creation I do on YouTube. So in my spare time, when I wasn't doing those two things, I've been working on the book for the past year or so. It took me about 8 or 9 months to write the content and then another 3 months to get it all formatted and ready for launch. And it came out less than 2 weeks ago, and I'm just super stoked with the response that it's received thus far, especially considering that I don't have an agent, I don't have a publishing house, I don't have a sales team, I don't have a marketer. And it's a number one bestseller in a number of Amazon categories right now, which is just phenomenal that's
Amazing,
possible. Right. And no small part due to some of the advice that you gave me. I thanked you in the book, and I'll thank you here on the podcast as well.
Yeah, I skipped to the end to get the shout out because a friend of mine, I don't know if you know Jason Hartman, but he's in real estate business. He sent me a WhatsApp message. He's like, "Hey, gave you a shout out at the end of the book." I just skipped to the acknowledgments, but I'm only at chapter 5 because I'm a very slow listener when it comes to audiobooks, but thus far it's been good. So I wanted to go through a couple of chapters, maybe get you to summarize them a little bit, give the viewers some insight, maybe talk a little bit about why they should get the book, who the book is for. Maybe, is there a demographic that you would say the book is not for? Like, if you had any challenges from anybody on it?
Well, I wrote the book for everybody, but I'm sure not everyone will be for the book. That's kind of the way I put it. It's not explicitly for men, at least not exclusively.
Mhm.
I mentioned that in the preface, and I think that's because any kind of sustainable solution in the sexual marketplace has to be palatable to both men and women. And I think that prioritizing one side's needs and wants unduly over the other is not really a recipe for long-term success.
Mhm.
That said, I can imagine that the book would be challenging for folks who have a more romanticized view of relationships. I mean, the subtitle is Understanding the Economic Model of Relationships, and putting the word economic that close to relationship already ruffles a lot of people's feathers.
Mhm. Have you had any negative reviews or any hate from anybody, like anybody in your professional community at all? I was actually curious as I was listening to it, how they would have received it had they gone through the whole thing.
No, not yet. Hopefully not ever. I think it would require a lot of investment to go through a 400-page book that you dislike,
Yeah.
and then to leave a negative review. So I think that's just a barrier to entry that most people who disagree with the message aren't willing to cross.
Hopefully.
So far the response has been overwhelmingly positive.
Yeah, you'll get called a misogynist at some point if it hasn't happened yet. It's
Oh, I've been called that, just not in response to the book.
Yeah. So a few of the chapters here, and again, I've only had the opportunity to get to about chapter 5. I was on a road trip the other week with my daughter, and I did ask you, I was like, would this be appropriate?
Did you put it on?
50? No, I didn't. I got another book instead. I got Suzanne Vanker's, like something along the lines of How to Win at Life. And it was actually a reasonable sequence of ideas dispensed for women, which I thought were pretty good. I got to reach out to her, maybe get her on a podcast in the future. There's a couple of things that I would definitely challenge her on, like things around money and some of the advice she dispensed around dating. But I want to come back to your stuff here. So I've gotten to chapter 5. You start talking about negotiation. Let's kind of enter this with the economic models and the value on the sexual marketplace. What do you mean by our value as humans on the sexual marketplace in the book as it's written?
Well, I don't usually say our value as humans. I explicitly talk about our value in the sexual marketplace, which is very contextually defined. It's obviously a very touchy subject to start talking about people's intrinsic or fundamental value as people. And so that's why I don't do that. But in a marketplace, things have prices. And in general, people trade all kinds of things of comparable value. And that's sort of the basis of exchange, is that we trade unequal things of comparable value.
Mm.
And if the things are too different with respect to their valuations, no transaction occurs. And my fundamental premise is that people have needs, people want things from other people. And so the pro-social solution that human beings have created over tens of thousands of years is to move towards each other and attempt to give other people what they might want in exchange for what they want in return.
Mm.
And that's the basis of society, and that's the basis of relationships. And when that occurs, and both people are more or less getting what they need and want, then individuals, relationships, and societies thrive. And for whatever reason, if that exchange is not possible, no relationship exists. And to my mind, this helps explain why some people are rich in relationship opportunities of all kinds, whether they're romantic or professional friendships, and other people are not. It's not the good people, it's not the loving people, it's not the virtuous people who are rich in relationship opportunities. It's the people that other people want things from.
Mm.
And the more that you have what more people more want, it's a little awkward, but it works, the more likely you're going to have relationship opportunities of all kinds.
Did you get into in the book how to establish one's sexual marketplace value for men and women?
Yeah. Chapter 3 is all about sexual marketplace value, which I had to sort of define because the whole book is about value, right?
Mhm.
And sexual marketplace value is something that people are understandably very sensitive about, at least when it's applied to themselves. Everyone makes use of it to some degree when selecting for relationships, even if it's just a quantity as opposed to like a numeric value. When people tell women that they could do better, they're making use of sexual marketplace value as a quantity, if not as a specific number. And the economic principle is that you have limited time, energy, attention. Most people are looking for a monogamous relationship, which means that if they're exchanging that commitment to one person, they're not giving it to any other person on the planet. So they understandably want to be sure that they're transacting with their perceived best option. They're getting the most for what they're willing to give in return.
Mhm.
And
Is there
sexual
a
marketplace value is generally how people determine what their perceived best option is when they're looking to mate and date.
is there a sequence of steps, or this plus this will sort of equal your SMV? Is there a way that the average man or woman can establish what their value looks like and where their opportunities lie to improve?
Yeah, it's really tough. Sexual marketplace value is actually a fairly complicated subject. That's why I talk about that there's 3 different kinds. There's what I call normalized sexual marketplace value, perceived sexual marketplace value, and transacted sexual marketplace value. Normalized sexual marketplace value is basically how much a given man or a woman models the archetype of attractiveness held out by his or her culture. This is both culturally informed and biologically determined. So this is sort of like the more a woman looks like a supermodel, the more conventionally attractive she is, the more a man looks like a Hollywood movie star and has that kind of status and success, the higher his normalized sexual marketplace value would be. The issue with that is that people do have individual tastes and preferences that deviate from those conventional norms. And some of this is socially desirable responses. People say, oh, money doesn't matter to me, or height doesn't matter to me, et cetera, et cetera. It's hard to, you can trust that to a point. I think that a lot of people are afraid of coming off as too superficial or materialistic, and so they cover their preferences. But people generally do have legitimate differences in tastes, and that is what perceived sexual marketplace value is. Value doesn't exist objectively. It exists in the mind of the valuer. And ultimately, that's what determines whether 2 people enter into a relationship, is that I see you as a high value woman, you see me as a high value man, etc. And then ultimately, value is created at the point of transaction. Like nothing is worth anything until somebody's actually willing to pay for it and the other party accepts that payment, at which point in time that thing is worth exactly what it was transacted for. And so transacted sexual marketplace value has to do with examining the types of relationships that men and women have entered into in the past to sort of do a comparable comparison to their current sexual marketplace value, in the same way that houses are generally valued by comparing the value at which comparable houses of the same size in the same neighborhood were recently sold at.
Mm-hmm.
And so for men, that transacted sexual marketplace value has to do with how attractive the women are that he was able to sleep with. And for women, that transacted sexual marketplace value is how attractive those men are that she was able to achieve commitment from. So they're gendered, and they're gendered in the way that it's typically harder for them to get. Like, it's easier for women to get sex than commitment because they're the gatekeepers of sex.
Mm-hmm.
And it's generally harder for men to get sex than commitment. And so each gender is more or less measured based on the good that it's harder for them to achieve.
Do you think that the differences that exist between men and women, like, for example, it's been said that men are success objects to women and women are beauty objects to men. Do you think that that rings true?
Sure, in a lot of different ways. Now, that's obviously, it's changing to a certain extent given women's relative material success in 2024.
You talked about all these women that now have boats.
Oh, really? There's some boat captains out there.
Oh, you're talking about it in
my book.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So a lot of women do have their own boats. They're captains of their own ships. And generally what people want is what people lack. In fact, that word want has two meanings. One is to desire, and one is to lack. Like, when we talk about extreme want, we talk about extreme poverty. And it makes sense that what you lack is precisely what you would desire, because you'd like to fill that void, whatever that is. And generally, the more people have, the harder it is to find what they might want because they lack less and less.
Mm.
That said, I think women still want to enter into relationships that will significantly improve their standard of living. And because they're doing so well, that diminishes the pool of potential candidates that they're likely to mate with.
I think you've done videos on this where you talk about, like, how women have priced themselves out of the dating market, and there's this sort of chasm that exists where you have all these female captains now, and then you have male captains, and male captains don't really need a female captain. They certainly don't want their boat if they have a better boat. So it's like, what is the solution to this like void, that, like, this chasm that's being created, between men and women, because women have been told, go out there, put off having a family, climb the corporate ladder, get a degree. Is there anybody out there talking to women and giving them useful, actionable advice so that they can get what they want earlier on in life?
With respect to their long-term goals, not that I'm aware of. Most of the content that I'm aware that's directed towards women is about getting what they want at that stage in their life, which in their 20s is generally not about starting a family and finding a long-term partner, for better or for worse.
I don't think they would listen to the advice even if they had somebody shouting at the top of a building, would they?
They might not. I mean, I certainly got some good advice when I was a young man that I didn't follow. On some level, people do have to make their own mistakes.
Yeah.
Unfortunately.
Yeah, there's a lot of truth to that. Yeah, it's like, Moff and I were doing this ladies' night series for well over a year now, and it's like one of the things that we just found popped up over and over again was the gals were just, they would come to the acceptance and the realization by the time they hit usually 30s, definitely 40s for sure. Having that conversation in their 20s was very rare. There was only a very, very small contingent, maybe less than 5% of women that we had on the show that were willing to hear the narrative, like, preserve your value. It's a good idea if you want to have a family to start looking at, locking a guy down, and this is how you do it, and this is what men are attracted to. But the vast majority of them are just like, YOLO, gonna go out and have some fun, and we'll deal with that one later. You talk about negotiation in the book, and there's a few people I think that might take issue with the notion of negotiating a relationship. It's been said that if you start to negotiate terms of a relationship, it sort of leads down the path of obligated compliance and then resentment, sort of, as you travel down that. I didn't take it as you talking in that sense or regard, but what did you mean when it came to the point in the book about negotiating the almost like the terms of that relationship?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that when it gets to the point where you're using your words to explicitly negotiate the terms of relationships, that's actually generally a suboptimal outcome. That doesn't necessarily mean that relationships aren't negotiated in nonverbal and indirect means all the time. And that's generally what the courtship is for. In general, men go to the sexual marketplace to exchange resources for sexual opportunity, and women are attempting to exchange their sexual opportunity for resources. All things being equal, both sides want to maximize their gain and minimize their loss, which means that most men would ideally get a lot of sexual opportunity very cheaply. It doesn't cost them a lot of time, energy, and money to do so. Whereas vice versa for women, they would prefer to get as much as they can and to not necessarily give much in return. It's that kind of selfishness and self-interest that drives competitive negotiation. So this can be explicitly discussed between men and women, but it's usually discussed behaviorally and non-verbally. Like, for example, if a woman makes a man wait certain number of dates or a period of time before she has sex with him, even if that's not like explicitly negotiated, what is behaviorally taking place is they're both deciding that the value of my sexual opportunity is worth this much time, this much attention, this much courtship. And that sets kind of a standard for the basis of the relationship moving forward. Like, the longer that a woman makes a man wait, the higher she's pricing her sexual opportunity. And that becomes an anchor point for the sexual relationship moving forward.
With
And
that
vice versa.
man, but that negotiation, as you put it, could be completely different for a guy that she's got a strong draw to. Could happen on the
Absolutely.
first date, right?
Women want different things from different men at different times,
Yeah,
which is not
very
very
true.
satisfying, but it is true.
And that also changes. It's not even just different times in their life; it's also different times of the month for them as well, because of their ovulatory shift too, right?
I have sympathy for that, man. It's like, if my hormones were all over the place too, I would have a tough time.
Yeah. You talk about the most powerful player wins the game. What do you mean by that?
Well, I conceive of negotiation as a game. It's the game of getting what you want from other people.
Mhm.
And that game can be played out in lots of different ways, in lots of different contexts, between lots of different people. But ultimately, the one who wins the game of negotiation is the more powerful player. And power is also kind of tricky to define because there's lots of what I call power proxies. These are things like being physically strong or rich or high status. These things are often confused with power, but are not technically power. If those things were technically power, then nobody weaker or lower status or poorer should ever be able to defeat a strong, physically stronger, higher status, richer person. And we see that all the time. Kings get toppled, politicians' careers are ruined, and that shouldn't be possible if the less powerful people were really less powerful. Now, the reason for that is power is the ability to get other people to do what you want, in so many words,
Mhm.
which means that power is ultimately psychological. It's my ability to reach into you in some way, generally with my words or with my incentives, to motivate you to forget what you want and do what I want instead. They're all functionally forms of emotional manipulation. And that is actually the lever of power that gets people to move, is that something is incited inside of themselves that compels them or incites them to move in your chosen direction. And you can do that without being physically strong. You can do that without having a lot of money, and you can do that without being high status. Obviously, it's easier to do those to impel motivation in others with those things, and those things are good in and of themselves, but they only work to the extent that they can excite that emotional motivation inside of other people. Does that
What do you
make
think of
sense?
the yeah? What do you think of Robert Greene's book, The 48 Laws of Power? Since we were talking about power,
Yeah, I'm actually about 75% of the way through it now. It's my first read through.
okay,
Embarrassed to admit it's a
it's like drinking.
fantastic book.
Yeah, it's like drinking from the fire hose. There's a lot in there.
Yeah, and it takes a long time to digest. Clearly a very well thought out, beautiful, interesting book. Like, I
Mm,
wish I had read it a long time ago.
yeah.
And he has a lot of principles of power, obviously, in that book. I haven't read anything that I really disagreed with. The difficulty, though, with that book is it's sometimes hard to know who the more powerful player is, because so many of those principles are like covert. They're inside of the person. It's hard to like look at a person and know who might be more powerful in a given interaction. And so when I talk about in my book, my principles of power, I list out 10 of them, and they're all principles that are overt and obvious, and you can see and measure to some extent.
Can you give us the 10 principles of power?
I don't know if I can list them all off the top of my head, but I can try to rattle off a few of them. One of them is, in general, the more powerful player is the one who moves less. So this is one of the easiest ones to see in a given relationship. Think about a king's court. A king sits on his throne. The whole court revolves around him. If you want an audience with the king, you come to the king. And the further you travel, the more respect you're paying to that person. The king doesn't go to you, and he certainly doesn't meet halfway. Do you understand? So when it comes to romantic relationships, you can tell who moves less by examining, well, who initiates contact more frequently? What is the length and tone of those communications? Just compare your emails to your boss with your boss's emails to you. Your boss generally takes longer to respond, uses fewer words, sometimes doesn't respond at all, because that's the prerogative of power. If you were the lower status person and you try to dispense with some of those formalities, it would come off as insubordinate. You wouldn't be able to pull it off. Like, the ability to move less is a prerogative of power. And so if you're concerned about who might have more power in a relationship, just examine who moves to whom. Like,
yeah, let's talk about that. Yeah, let's talk about that element of power, because I find that fascinating. I mentioned it in my book. If you're going to date, it's ideal, or it's a stronger show of her interest in you if she'll come to your front door rather than you going to her front door. And I saw a video that you published in the last few weeks where you were talking about the notion of a date really boils down to a sexual opportunity, and that's going to require access to somebody's place where the sexual opportunity can take place. And I think your recommendation, and you can correct me, obviously, was that they come to you so that you have access to your place, down the street. It's certainly one of the strongest indicators of genuine burning desire, in my eyes anyway, if she's willing to literally drive an hour, 2 hours to come and see you, basically at your front door. It doesn't necessarily have to be at your house. It could be at a bar or restaurant down the street from your house. But the further she has to travel to make the effort to come and see you, the greater the interest. And I always find it's interesting, because one of the complaints that I hear from a lot of guys when I talk to them is, oh, I had this date, lined up, and there's about an hour's distance, between us, and we were going to meet halfway, and she flaked on me because of the 30-minute drive. And it's just like, yeah, you don't have better options, and she figured that it wasn't worth her while. Does that sound about right to you? With that notion of power and them coming to your
Absolutely,
location, to your vicinity?
And I think you summarized some of my ideas very well. What I generally say is that a date is connection plus sexual opportunity.
Right.
You need both. And that's why it's God's perfect creation, because when everything goes well, both the man and the woman get what they want. The woman gets her connection. She gets attended to. She gets her emotional stimulation. She gets her attention. She gets the dinner and the affection. And if everything goes right, the man gets his sexual experience, which is pretty self-explanatory. And in general, it's the man's responsibility to direct the relationship in the direction of a sexual encounter. Like, it's pretty rare for a woman to do that. She has to be very, very attracted and sort of like fed up with the man's unwillingness to lead. And then she does it more or less out of desperation. In general, men have to move the encounter in the direction of a sexual relationship. And that's why it's generally useful to schedule the logistics of dates around a man's place. Because if you're halfway, well, where do you go? Are you going to rent a hotel? Are you going to get on a subway and go to their house? Well, you can't really invite yourself into their space anyway. And so it's useful to have the space that you can invite the woman back to, so that when the date is going well, it's actually fairly effortless to guide the interaction in that direction. Does that make sense?
Yeah, the opportunity to escalate needs to exist. Otherwise, it's just an interview, isn't it?
That's what I say. Yeah, absolutely. And I don't want to sign up for an interview. I mean, that sounds really lame.
No, it is. No, it's absolutely true. And guys need to get it through their heads. Like, the point of a date is to lead to escalation at some point, not just sit there back to back doing interviews, feeding women, and never having the opportunity to see them again or to escalate. So,
And a lot of women are bad at this. And I talk about this
Mhm.
in the book a little bit later, is I understand the impulse to want to interview a man. They're trying to do their due diligence to see, who is this guy? What's he about? Are we compatible, etc. But one of the worst ways to figure that out is by asking direct questions.
Mhm.
Like, if a woman asks both an honest and a dishonest man, "Are you honest?" She's going to be told yes by both men. That is a bad question because it functionally doesn't differentiate between those two classes of individuals. This is why successful companies, they don't simply or even ever rely on structured interviews to hire. They
Mhm.
give them actual tasks that they're expected to perform in the course of their duties, like lateral creative problem solving things to test their divergent thinking and their creativity. They invite them to dinner with the other partners of the firm so that you know if they're a decent guy and can get along with the other partners of the firm. It's like there's lots, you call their previous employers and their references. You do a lot of indirect due diligence, and that's generally a better way of figuring out who you're dealing with than simply asking them to tell you about themselves.
Yeah, it's like the whole stated preferences usually conflict with the observed behavior.
Sure. And it's also not a lot of fun to just answer a bunch of questions. It's
No.
not fun for the women and it's not fun for the men. And generally, what happens is when these women enter into dates with that interview mentality, well, they just get a lot of factual information when the man complies with it,
Yeah.
which doesn't make her feel anything. And so she leaves the date with a lot of information, but no feeling, which she's going to use to inform her decision about whether or not to see that man again.
Mm.
And if she kind of feels nothing really, then there's probably not going to be a second date.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, Sorry. Okay, so we were talking about a bunch of the power plays. What were a few more, if you can recall? You said there was 10. We covered one of them. About
One of them is
insanity.
the willingness to transgress. So
Mhm.
these principles of power are sort of value neutral. I'm not advocating for any of these things. I'm just sort of relating what tends to be associated with power. And one of them is the willingness to transgress. Basically, those who are willing to violate not only just like the laws, but most people are shackled internally. They're shackled internally by their ideal self that was usually put into their minds by their parents, their culture, and their early relationships. And so lots of people are playing in a much smaller field of play than they really have to, which makes it more difficult for them to maneuver. Like if you can only zig, but I can zig and zag, it's going to be hard for you to beat me. I have more space to play, I have more maneuvers. And so it's going to be more difficult for you to go head to head with me, right?
Mhm.
So, for better or for worse, those who operate under a larger field of play and are more willing to execute more varied maneuvers generally have a larger playbook, which is often associated with greater success.
Um,
Fouling is also part of the game. That's another thing to consider, is that every game has a set of rules, and usually violation of those rules is very clearly defined as also the penalties associated with them.
mm,
But like if you wanted to be a top ranked tennis player and to never ever have a ball go out of bounds, like good luck with that. If you want to be an NBA player and never commit a personal foul, like good luck with that. You'd have to be so much better than anybody else you're playing against to restrict yourself in that way. And that just wouldn't be possible because at those highest levels of performance, the difference between the first place and the 100th place is actually very small. Sometimes it's measured in
tenths of a second.
seconds,
Yeah.
milliseconds
Yeah.
even. You wouldn't be able to win.
Why is attractiveness the key to power in sexual relationships?
Well, attractiveness is the key to power because generally it helps attractive people get more of what they want across all three phases of the relationship, which I say is attraction, negotiation, and maintenance. Attractive people are more likely to be selected. If they're attractive passengers, captains can see them more obviously among the group of folks in front of his ship. And attractive captains are targeted more often by passengers for passage on their ships. Attractive people can negotiate better terms for themselves. They generally get more of what they want and less of what they don't, whether that's fair or not. And they're more likely to maintain their relationships if they so desire, because one, they generally have more optionality than the person they're dealing with, which means that they're also more powerful, and the other person might be more invested in the relationship. Maintenance also allows them to defend their relationship against their intrasexual competition more readily. So if you're a more attractive option, people generally aren't going to leave you for a less attractive option. Let's put it that way.
So the maintenance phase, I think, is a tough phase it's actually not the tough phase, I would say. It's the most often neglected phase.
Mm-hmm.
Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I talk about that in the book. And the reason for that is you have to you have to successfully navigate the attraction and the negotiation phase to get to the maintenance phase. And there's attrition at every level of the sales funnel, right? So fewer people end up in the maintenance phase by definition.
The maintenance phase is interesting because it's different for men and women. I mean, if you get into a situation where you've gotten married or you live in a way that looks like marriage to the state, you still have an obligation as a man to a woman to maintain and ideally become a better version of yourself than you were, 5-6 years ago when you perhaps met her. The flip side of that, though, is women don't necessarily have that same obligation because the tolerances that men and women have for each other in the maintenance phase are quite different, aren't they?
It can be. I've heard the jokes say that men get married hoping that the woman will never change, and women get married hoping that the man will.
Yeah.
And I think one way around that, it's certainly not a guarantee. Nothing is a guarantee with relationships or with women. But one of the strongest indicators of that is to get involved in a long-term relationship with somebody with a growth mindset. And some women do have that. And they do value bettering themselves and maintaining their appearance and broadening and enriching their experience. They find that intrinsically valuable. But if you don't have a woman like that, it's going to require a lot of cajoling or ultimatums or other kinds of nastiness. And there's not much you can do about it.
Why does love have nothing to do with relationships?
Oh, yeah. That's my favorite chapter in the book. Love doesn't have anything to do with relationships because relationships are fundamentally about the transaction of value, right? People need and want things from other people, and they trade those things. And the value of those things it emerges out of the trading. The issue is that love, like loyalty and friendship, can't be bought or earned. It's always given spontaneously at the pleasure of the giver with no strings attached, which means that it's kind of valueless or invaluable. Because even if the price tag is exorbitant, things that have a value can be bought. You know what I'm saying? But love can't ever be bought, which means that there's nothing that you can do to earn it. There's nothing that you can do to get it, if that's what you're looking for. It's always just given at the mysterious pleasure of the giver. We also know that it's not necessary to have a relationship to love. People every day love people that they're not in relationships. And often they're in relationships with people that they don't love. So if both of those things are true, I don't see how we can say that the basis of relationships is love. People generally don't end up with the people who love them the most. It's not like love always wins in the end. Life is not a romantic comedy. Now, this is not to say that people in relationships can't love each other, but that has nothing to do with really what they're giving each other. That's almost like a happy coincidence. If that love were based on what they were receiving in the relationship, then that love would have a value, the value of what they were receiving. which would make love transactional, which I don't think it is. So that's kind of why I think that love doesn't have anything to do with relationships.
I had an interesting conversation with a guy yesterday. I did a live Twitter X Space, whatever you want to call them, and this guy was mentioning that the last, I don't know, 5 or 6 gals that he's been with, and it happened with every single one of them within a span of about, he said, 4 to 5 weeks or so. But they would profess being in love with him very rapidly, which is
good for him.
Genuinely unusual. It's like, I think most guys' experience with that is that it's like constipation. Women really struggle to get it out, and they like to hold it back. And when it's out, it's like, okay, it's obvious. Like, she definitely loves this guy. And I asked him, I said to him, I go, is it like I love you, or kind of like I love your guts, sort of thing? Like it's a casual, sort of like friendly, playful way about it. But no, it's like I am in love with you. And that's a very strong come on for most guys within a span of like 4 or 5 weeks of meeting a woman. What's your take on that? I'm curious.
It is possible. Like I've worked closely with some men who were very, very good at cultivating that kind of emotional reaction in women. And they generally did this by playing up the romantic dimensions of the relationship. They did it by really pitching them a dream. And those men very early on were talking about a future that they saw with this woman, or that this woman was the most beautiful, the most amazing person that they've ever met. And maybe they even met in a previous life, and that there's some sort of deep karmic, cosmic connection between the two of them. And they sweep them off their feet and take them to Michelin star restaurants. And it's almost like you're the girl who gets the attention from the prince in the movie. It's like you're whisked very suddenly into this entirely new world from a attractive, successful man who seems to be unilaterally and intensely devoted to you. That will make a woman fall in love in 4 to 5 weeks. Now,
was that the guys admitting the strategy, or was that the women telling the story of their experience about how they felt?
No, this is the men telling me what works.
Okay, got
it. They didn't always or ever mean those things in the way that the woman received them.
Lip service,
when I spoke with a number of these guys, we discovered that strategy on their part, which was very effective, was designed to protect themselves, because they felt that if they could get a woman to love them at that level of intensity, well, that woman wouldn't be leaving him, and that he would be protected against her rejection. Generally, though, what happened was the man in question was unable to sustain that level of interest and passion and courtship. And the woman first becomes a little confused, and then a little disappointed, and then a little irate, or a lot irate.
Obviously.
And she kind of sees through it. And often these relationships that burn really bright, really fast, also burn out very quickly in extravagant ways.
You have another chapter in the book that's titled "People Really Don't Want Relationships," and again, guys, I haven't gotten that far in the book yet, so I'm very curious as to the story behind that one as well.
Sure. I mean, the basis of that chapter, which I think is the last chapter in the book, was actually spelled out on the first page, which is that people enter into relationships because they want things from other people. And one way that they've discovered to get those things is by exchanging unequal goods of comparable value in relationship. But that generally means, technically, that people don't want relationships. They want the value that is transacted in those relationships. And entering into a relationship is just one way that people have discovered of getting that value. If those people find ways that are safer, cheaper, or easier to get the same value, they are going to prefer those ways to entering into relationships with men and women. And that's, I think, precisely what we're seeing. We are in the midst of a relationship crisis, Rich, as you know. Like in the last 10 years, the number of men and women who are getting married, entering into relationships, or even hooking up have dropped precipitously in some cases to historically unprecedented lows. Like the marriage rate in America is the lowest it's ever been in recorded history, for instance. And I think that has to do with the fact that we now have some possibilities of getting what we want, or at least something very similar to it, more easily, more cheaply, and more safely elsewhere than dealing with the opposite sex. And that's precisely what is happening. And it's kind of rational. Like
No, it
very
makes
few
sense that we're
people are going
getting
to
there.
choose a more expensive, riskier, and more inaccessible solution over one that's safer, cheaper, and easier.
What are the, like in your practice itself, dealing with your clients, what are the biggest grievances that men express that are that much different from the ones that women are expressing? Like, what are the differences in the sexes there from where you're sitting?
It's going to sound bad, but a lot of men, they come to me and they really want to know what a woman wants. Like, help me figure out women. And I think on the whole, that's because they're good faith actors in relationships. They're like, okay, clearly I've had some issues attracting or maintaining relationships with women. Maybe if I get better at understanding what women really want and I can get better at giving it to them, maybe I can have more satisfying relationships with women in the future. When I talk to women, they're not concerned about what men want. They're concerned about how do I get what I want. Both men and women are trying to figure out how to give women
what they want. Interesting.
And that's, in my experience, the biggest difference between my consultations between men and women. I've never had a woman come to me and say, Orion, help me understand men so I can give them more of what they want, because I understand that that could be the secret of a successful relationship, which it is. Like when two people are effortlessly and reciprocally getting their needs met, that's a good relationship. When people say, I love this, it's because they're getting a lot of what they want and a little of what they don't. And that love, that positive emotionality, in my opinion, isn't technically love. It's the satisfaction of being gratified. And that's generally what people are looking for when they enter into relationships.
Yeah, it's interesting when you sort of marinate on that soundbite for a bit, because it's like, guys are trying to give women what they want to attract and retain them, and women are trying to get what they want from guys, not that concerned with what guys want.
And when the women come to me and say, how can I get more of what I want? And I start to explain, well, you have to understand what men want. And by giving men more of what they want, you have the best chance of getting what you want.
How do they like that?
That's a tough sell. A lot of them are like, that's interesting. I don't really want to do that though.
Yeah, I can't remember where I heard this. It was definitely in my youth, but it was a line, something along the soundbite of, you can get anything in the world that you want if you help as many people get what they want. And I think that guys definitely subscribe to that, especially when it comes to attracting and retaining women. But you're not always going to get that
work,
on the other
Rich.
side.
As you know, sometimes people can work very hard and be taken advantage of or taken for granted.
Yeah.
But absolutely, that's probably the best chance that you have of becoming successful, broadly defined, is being used by other people in a way that's important and necessary for their needs and desires. Is you have to allow yourself to be used. As a guy, we understand that. You can't expect to get paid if you're not used in terms of your time, your energy, and your skill set. Expecting the paycheck without being used is absurd.
Yeah, you're very honest in that, especially when you break it down in your videos. Like, I love the way that you break it down in the videos. It's just so clear and concise. Let me just grab this over here. It says, Ryan's work is applied Evo Psych. Rich's work is raw truth. Thanks to both of you. My life is not just better, it's perfect, eternally grateful.
Right on.
That's I don't know what a BNG is or what country that's from, but thank you, Zornitska. I think I'm pronouncing that right.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's it's really interesting. Like, you got to take all these different perspectives and sort of weigh them out. And like, your book is very densely packed with useful and expensive words. I'm again halfway through it, and it's one of those books that I know that I'm going to have to go through twice and start to bookmark the stuff as I'm doing it. It's a greater, how can I sell this? your videos are like an introduction to the ideas that the book sort of expands on in a lot more depth. Like when you did the talk on the sailboat thing at my forum back in January here in Toronto, I thought the way that you went into the analogy and how that works, differences, between men and women, you got like right into the weeds. So it's like, if you like Orion's videos and you think that the value that you're getting out of them is right there, you're going to go even further down the rabbit hole if you get the book. And I do recommend it. It's going to go on my recommended reading list to the guys that I talk to for sure. Congratulations on the bestseller, everything that's going on with it. Is there a follow-up coming? Like, are you going to work on another one? Or
I would like to write another book. I had so much fun writing this one, actually.
Yeah.
But it just was released 2 weeks ago. I'm going to be doing a lot of appearances to promote it.
Of course.
I might need a break before I start another project. And I think my next goal might be to create some sort of community before I focus on writing another book. But yeah, I have lots of ideas, lots of things I'd like to talk about.
Fantastic.
It's not a casual book like you were getting at. Yeah. It generally requires your concentration and attention, and some things you might have to sit with before they start to make sense. I did try to explain everything as clearly and simply as I could, and if I failed in that, that's really my fault. It's also a different medium. Like the YouTube it's for a more popular audience. It's, I think, more casual. It's the spoken word. Whereas a book, this is something that I hope might still be relevant in 100 years. That was my goal in writing it. I didn't want to make something that was just a pamphlet that might have been a quick cash grab because of my internet celebrity. And I also didn't want to write something that in a couple of years would be obsolete because it was just speaking about the popular moment today, which will change as soon as it's identified.
Yeah, I think you'll find it'll be evergreen for a while.
I hope so. That's my intention anyway.
And it's one of those ones that even if you listen to audiobooks, guys, I would recommend getting the print version just so you can highlight it and underline stuff, because it's one of those ones where you're going to, dog ear the pages, or you're going to start to mark it up. And it's worthwhile doing that because, I mean, if you ever have somebody that needs, that type of content and they're not the sort that sort of will go out and buy a book or whatever, you can just hand them your copy and they'll have what they need out of it as well too. So there's that. What's up and coming for you, man? You were talking about a few things there. The channel's been very successful. I think you're going to hit 1 million subs probably within the next 12 months for sure. The book knocked it out of the park. So congrats on that. What else is up and coming for you?
Well, I'm going to a number of different podcast appearances these days. I was just on Michael Sartain's podcast. We recorded this past weekend. I think the episode drops tomorrow.
Did you do it with Rollo too, or just Michael?
It was just Michael. I haven't met Rollo yet.
Okay.
And I was on Diary of a CEO a few days ago as well.
That guy's interesting. He's a very good interviewer.
He's an excellent interviewer. I had a wonderful time. He was empathic and authentic and very well informed. He clearly takes what he does very seriously. And his team was also excellent. He has like 10 people at least who are working, and they're all very friendly and competent. And I had a great experience.
Awesome. Cool. All right, well, guys, we'll wrap it up on that note. You can find it on Amazon. It's a self-published copy. It's Orion Taraban. Show them the cover. There you go. So it's easy to find. It's right on the bestsellers list. It's hang on, Moff's here in the chat. How do I get a signed copy of the book?
A few people have requested that, and I'm still trying to figure out how I can logistically offer that. Because it probably means. Do you have a suggestion, Rich?
Well, I was going to suggest, we talked offline about, doing my event next May. So if you're going to be there, maybe one of the things I can do is grab a box of your books, and maybe you can sign a few for some people.
Oh, that would be wonderful. Yeah. And I can't wait, man. I had such a good time at your conference in January. I was really impressed by your community and what you've been able to build. And it was a lot of fun getting to meet the other presenters and also the attendees. I had a wonderful experience.
Yeah, you guys will want to be on my email list to get notified when the tickets go on sale, but we're just working out the details right now. It's going to be in the Bahamas in May of 2025.
So much nicer than Toronto in January. Thank you for doing that, Rich.
Yeah, Toronto was sort of a test venue. I wanted to see what was going to happen, if people even had the appetite to buy a ticket and the fly-in sort of thing. But Bahamas is it's a much nicer venue, and it's a nicer place to be. So keep an eye out for that one. But again, thanks for popping in, guys. Grab a copy of the book. Orion, all the best with your future endeavors and success with this book.
Thanks, Rich.
Thanks.